Thank you, Swati, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our monthly DMS technical assistance call. I have a couple short announcements before we get into the main content. First, this is an announcement that's primarily of interest to Part B folks, and that is that the EdFacts information collection packages for school years 22-23, 23-24, and 24-25 are open for the 60-day public comment period, and that will end on January 14th. And with all the holidays coming up and people taking leave, that will be here before you know it. So I wanted to call attention to that and the date. Very briefly here, there are several changes being proposed from the current EdFacts data collection for 618. There'll be a change in the Part B personnel data collection. That will be a revision of the age groups. There will be a change in the Part B maintenance of effort reduction and coordinated early intervening services data collection. And that change will involve the addition of 4 new data elements. I won't go over those now, but if you're interested, you can log in and take a look at those. Thirdly, for the assessment data collection, there will be 2 new disaggregations of the participation and performance data. And those will be 1, a disaggregation by major racial and ethnic groups, and 2, disaggregation by disability categories. And then lastly, the IDEA state supplement survey will be split into 2 separate surveys. And the message, I sent a message out on this just a few minutes ago that goes into some of the reasons why, but also provides links that you can use to access this information. Second announcement I have, which I think will lead us into the content of today's webinar, is that on November 10th, David Cantrell, the acting director of OSEP, sent a letter, 2 separate letters, one to Part C coordinators, the other to Part B state directors, which emphasized the importance of the department's monitoring of states to make sure that they meet their general supervisory obligations under Part B and Part C of the IDEA, so that eligible children will receive the services to which they're entitled under either Part B or Part C. The letter also lays out the expectation that states ensure that their local programs comply with IDEA requirements, including child find evaluation, appropriate IEPs or IFSPs, and also mentions that it's equally important that states and local programs properly address the equitable treatment of all eligible students with disabilities, with a particular focus on children from low-income backgrounds, children who are racial or ethnic minorities, who are English learners, or who are experiencing homeless, because we know kids with disabilities were disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, and that children in these additional groups were even further impacted. So this was just a message reiterating our expectations. Also, we continue to get questions about whether or not the IDEA requirements have been waived, and they haven't. And this just clarifies that despite the pandemic, and we know that you're all making great efforts to rise to the challenges presented by the pandemic, but that despite that, that kids with disabilities continue to have their IDEA rights available to them. So that kind of leads us into our topic today on general supervision. And I will turn the webinar over to Brenda Wilkins, a representative of our differentiated monitoring support implementation team. Brenda.
Thank you, Greg. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to go over the next couple of slides. Today, Swati, can we go back a little bit? Today, we're just going to talk about the OSEP funded TA centers and the resources that they have. Matt will talk a little bit about general supervision, specifically the expectations of, for general supervision generally during the pandemic. We will also talk about the timely identification and correction of noncompliance, and then 0902 reminders, equity considerations, and then Christine Pilgrim from the data IT team will be talking about APR reporting on compliance and correction. Next slide. Next slide, please. Oh, thank you. So we just wanted to reiterate our OSEP TA funded centers, or OSEP funded TA centers, DAISY, ECTA, and CSI, IDC. They all have a mirage of resources on DMS that are there to support you. So we highly encourage you to make full use of all of these resources and assistance from the TA centers. Some of the products that they have are just tools in general. Please participate in their cohort meetings and seek help in understanding anything DMS. We think that's pretty important. And then in general, just look at OSEP's protocols. We use these protocols as our main source of our monitoring tools. So please utilize those protocols as you enter into your next phase. And then engage us and your partners throughout the whole process. And then please consider support from other TA centers as appropriate, such as Cadre, CIFR, NTACT, NCEO, and then ECPC. That's a lot of acronyms. But there you go. So I am going to switch this over to Matt Schneer.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Brenda, and thank you, Greg. Appreciate everybody's attention today. I wanted to talk a little bit today, as we've said, about general supervision. Most of our DMS calls recently have been a lot about the process of DMS, and we want to start moving into some of the substance of what we'll be covering during our monitoring activities. As you all know, we are re-entering into our cohort 1 DMS activities. We have our first phase 2 visits will be scheduled in May and June. We'll be starting to re-engage with those cohort 1 states over the next few months. And we thought that it would be an appropriate time to really start trying to dig into some of the substance of what we're looking at through the monitoring. And as Greg said, I think the timing is good. The letters that he referenced give some general reminders about your responsibilities around general supervision, both during the pandemic and generally, and we think those are really important. And that links to what we, of course, are doing. As you know, our role is to work with you as our grantees to collectively ensure that we meet the shared mission of IDA, of serving infants, children, and youth with disabilities and their families. At the core of that role is monitoring. It's in the name of our office, and we do that, we accomplish that monitoring through a number of different ways. As you see on the slide, we have continued to hold states accountable for implementing IDA throughout the pandemic. We adjusted as necessary, as we expected you to do so, and did the pivot, but we still know that we are all collectively responsible for meeting all of those responsibilities. Next slide, please. So in general, we use at least 2 mechanisms for holding you, the states, accountable for meeting the requirements of IDA. And I want to emphasize this, as you'll see here, we're talking about the review of the SPP and the APR, which results in the issue of determinations, as well as monitoring through DMS. As noted earlier, Christine is going to be joining us later on in today's presentation to talk about some specific issues around the APR. But one of the, I think, the important messages we want to make to provide is that there is a linkage between all of the different work we do and the work that we expect of you. So the work that we do around the SPP APR in reviewing that is linked to the work that we do in DMS with similar issues, similar standards being applied. It's all part of the bigger piece of the pie of monitoring. And to the list, we can also add the review that we do of grant applications, as well as our day-to-day work that we do with your states. So just keep in mind those linkages, that when we look at information in the APR, it may come back up in the DMS or vice versa. And we, additionally, we know that the pandemic presented challenges to all of us, particularly at the local level. But as noted in the letters that were sent out, as well as recent guidance that we've issued, the responsibility to provide FAPE as well as early intervention services remains regardless of that situation. Okay, next slide, please. The next few slides are going to include information that I think you're all fairly familiar with. It's just on this slide, we see some of the key regulatory requirements for Part C and Part B that are in IDA. And we don't need to go through the details of them, but we think it's important to remember to stay grounded in these basic requirements in IDA for general supervision that are reflected here in this slide as well as elsewhere. Next slide, please. Similarly, in other parts of IDA, we have seen, if you look at 300 and 600, which is reflected here, that IDA requires that the primary focus of monitoring be on both improving results and functional outcomes, as well as ensuring that the basic program requirements under IDA are met. So there is that twin responsibility, which we believe are entwined, to look at both compliance and results. Ultimately, we think that looking at compliance helps us reach the outcomes that we want, but in and of itself, it's not sufficient. So that is implicit in the monitoring that we're doing and in our expectations of you, the states, as you work with your local programs, that you are looking at both of these areas moving forward. Next slide, please. As we've indicated throughout, states are responsible for ensuring the requirements of IDA are met even through these difficult circumstances of the pandemic, and are responsible for issuing findings as appropriate throughout this time. We do know, we would say that for areas that are impacted by the pandemic, states could and should consider all the different local implementation efforts, mitigation or remediation in determining what specific steps need to be taken to correct that specific non-compliance. This is consistent with information we've provided going back to OSEP Memo 0902. And they remind you that regardless of the specific level of non-compliance, the state is responsible for notifying the local program in writing of the non-compliance and ensuring correction, but what the nature of that correction can be appropriate to the circumstances that are occurring at the time. Next slide, please. So once again, at its core, a state's general supervision system must be able to identify and correct non-compliance in a timely manner. Certainly, we expect that upon discovery of non-compliance, notification of that noncompliance would be provided in a reasonable amount of time, usually within 3 months, and then correction should be accomplished as soon as possible, but in no case later than 1 year after the state's identification of noncompliance. So these are important reminders and core pieces of what we expect as we look at your general supervision systems. Next slide, please. As mentioned before, OSEP Memo 0902, which most of you should be familiar with, was issued back in 2008, and it does provide the standards for demonstrating correction. These standards, I want to emphasize, apply not only both to your monitoring findings and how you correct them, as well as how you report on noncompliance and the correction of noncompliance in the APR. And we will be returning to that later on in today's presentation. One of the things I wanted to do today is just to make you aware of some, in a general way, of some of the kinds of findings we have made in the past around general supervision. I think it's important that you're aware of these. These will help inform what we are doing in our own monitoring and as how you look at your own systems. So one of the things that we have said in past monitoring letters is that monitoring solely on SPP APR indicators is not in and of itself sufficient. This does not mean that you need to monitor on every specific indicator within every specific requirement within IDA, but you must have a reasonable system that is looking at local programs as a whole. For example, making sure that IAPs are compliant, services are being provided, and other things that may not be captured specifically in the SPP APR indicators themselves. It is also important, and we've made findings in this area, that you have mechanisms to ensure that any credible allegations of noncompliance, however they come to you, are followed up on, and if appropriate, that there is an investigation done, whether it's through a focused monitoring or some other kinds of methodology or through the dispute resolution mechanisms that we know that IDA has. In addition, we have made findings at times that states don't have a mechanism to monitor all of their local programs within a reasonable amount of time. So you want to look at your system to make sure that you are touching your programs in that kind of reasonable amount of time. And of course, as mentioned, states must ensure correction of non-compliance within 1 year. I would note that this includes corrective actions that are required by both state complaint investigations as well as due process hearings. In addition, it's important that states in situations where there is long-standing non-compliance, that states consider all available enforcement actions to them to ensure compliance, looking at what is allowable both under IDA and your own state rules to do what is necessary to move local programs into compliance. Next slide, please. On this slide, we see some additional findings that we have made, that findings were not made in a reasonable amount of time after the discovery of noncompliance. So if information comes to you that shows that there is noncompliance, as mentioned before, you do have an obligation to notify the local program of that noncompliance in a reasonable amount of time. And we have previously stated that generally we'd expect that to be within 3 months. We have made, in the past, there have been findings around the use of a threshold. So if in a particular area there is compliance, say above 95%, but not at 100%, finding was not made, that regardless of the percentage, as long as there is non-compliance, then a finding or the identification of non-compliance at the very least has to be completed. We also want to ensure that states use all of their components within their systems of general supervision. That includes dispute resolution, their data systems, all of these things to ensure correction of identified noncompliance in a timely manner. And finally, this last bullet here really references one of the prongs of 0902, that to ensure that that there is correction based not only on correcting the individual noncompliance, but policies and procedures to ensure that there won't be ongoing noncompliance moving forward, and a look at updated or subsequent data to ensure that the regulatory requirements are being met within those local programs. So that's just a sampling of findings that we have made in the past that help you think about your system and things that we will be looking at. We have our recent DMS findings are all posted on our website, and I urge you to be familiar with them as you think about your systems and prepare for our monitoring, as well as just reevaluating your systems from there. Next slide, please. What you see on this slide should look familiar. This is the first question from our integrated monitoring protocol that we will be using in phase 1 as we engage with states around integrated monitoring. And there are just a couple of things that I wanted to highlight here that sort of link into some of the things that we've talked about. Notably, if you look at the first question, it talks about what components of the state's general supervision system are used to both identify noncompliance and help to improve results and functional outcomes. So note that we are not just talking about noncompliance here, we're also talking about improved results or performance as well. That is reflected in the bullets, for example, how the state uses its data system to identify noncompliance and improve results and functional outcomes. So we think of these things as integrated pieces that we want to continue to be to messaging that general supervision looks at both of these. I'd also note that this question references the different components of a general supervision system. You will note the reference to dispute resolution systems, as well as to data systems and other things that are in there. So all of these things are pieces that we'll be looking at as we go through the protocols with you and examine your systems through our DMS system. Next slide, please. Finally, for me, just want to note, and this was something that Greg referenced, was talked about in the letters that were sent out, that we are all too well aware of the issues that plague us of inequities throughout our society. And I would note, at least from my perspective, at its core, IDEA is a statute that's rooted in the notion of equity specifically for students with disabilities. But beyond that, we do believe that it is our collective responsibility to pay attention to the issues at hand for our most vulnerable populations, those most affected by the pandemic and other situations, as we work to ensure compliance with IDEA and improve results, that we examine how these issues are affecting specifically people of color, people from low-income families, English learners, and those experiencing homelessness. And we urge you to take that into consideration as you work with your local programs moving forward. So thank you. With that, I am going to hand off to my colleague, Christine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matt. Good evening, everyone. I'm always pleased when I can join my DMS colleagues in any conversation, and just for us to have an opportunity for me really to reinforce all that Matt mentioned earlier about the linkages in terms of our accountability. So not looking at DMS and the SPP APR as two separate processes, but how linked they are and how connected they are. And these two things don't happen in isolation. So with these two last slides, I just wanted to remind you of a few things in terms of thinking about your SPP APR reporting when we're talking about reporting on the correction of noncompliance. And this is important because remember, as Matt was going through some of those slides and the one where it was talking about all of our previous, number of our previous findings in this general supervision space, there was one around sort of meeting these 0902 prongs. So in October's month, national TA call, I think it was back in October, all my days, months are running together. I had shared with you guys like how Jennifer Wolsheimer and I approach our quality assurance checks when it comes to 0902 and the specific things we're looking for in a state's reporting when they are demonstrating correction of previously identified noncompliance. So as noted on the slide, we are looking for states to describe how each LEA or EIS program with noncompliance is correctly implementing the specific regulatory requirements and has corrected each individual instance of specific child-specific noncompliance. And I think I told you then it's about 4 things that we look for. So the first thing we're looking for is when you're speaking about, how you've demonstrated that you have ensured that the district or the EIS program is correctly implementing the specific regulatory requirements, we're looking for mention of you looking at reviewing updated data or subsequent data. We're also looking to see that in your discussion about how you reviewed this updated or subsequent data, that the LEA or the EIS program achieved 100% compliance. We don't want to see that states are cutting and pasting the exact language from the 0902 memo into that narrative box and saying, sort of cutting and paste the language and this is how we met the requirement. We're looking for an actual description of what you did to ensure correction of previously identified noncompliance. So also, in addition to not cutting and pasting language from the memos solely, not giving us a description of a process that includes things like such as, we do things such as, or for example, but that you're actually reporting specifically what you did to ensure that there was correction of noncompliance in the year it was identified. So exactly what you did in that given year. And then finally, we're looking for you to speak to the fact that the child got whatever it was they were supposed to get, whether it was evaluation, may not have gotten it timely, but they did get the evaluation unless they were no longer in the jurisdiction of the LEA or EIS program. So just a little reminder, because we've spoken about this before, but it's always good to reinforce and also give you another hint like, hey, these are the things we look at when we're reviewing your submissions. Next slide, please, Swati. I see a question coming in from Tammy. Give me 1 second, I'll answer it, Tammy. And then the last thing I want to remind you about is we are very cognizant of what you have been going through during the pandemic. And as was the case with this year's submission of APRs, we told states, please share with us, describe how it is that COVID impacted your ability to collect and report data within the APR submission. And as we've shared before, we were truly grateful with the level of transparency across submissions. States were very honest in exactly how this was manifesting in the work in their state and how it affected data. And that helped us make very thoughtful decisions as we were looking at determinations, et cetera. So as it relates to reporting on the correction of noncompliance, obviously OSEP is expecting states to report on compliance levels within your APR under those compliance indicators, obviously, and then also the correction of findings that you identified previously. However, if COVID has impacted your ability to correct noncompliance, we want you to talk about that within your narrative. So give us that description on the impact of your data completeness. So reporting on the correction of previously identified noncompliance is part of your data. So you're describing that impact of COVID on your ability to do this. And we want you to be as specific as possible about that impact. How did it affect your ability to collect updated data or to review updated data? or were you not able to verify some aspects of correction with some of your districts, et cetera. And also a description of any steps that you took to mitigate the impact of that. So just wanted to give you those 2 reminders. I think this is my last slide, but I can look back at the question that Tammy asked. All right, so Tammy asked me if I am saying, and it's Swati, I hope it's okay that I just answered this right now, but it popped up in the chat, so I could as well go because it's only 4:32, we're good on time. Hopefully my colleagues don't mind that I've taken that liberty. It's specific to reporting on the correction of noncompliance. Tammy's asking if I'm saying that the description would be specific to each LEA instance situation. I think, you know, if you report correction like at a child level, so let's say you had 432 instances of noncompliance, in your description of what you did to ensure correction, I would be looking for you to describe that you looked at updated data, that you ensured that that data demonstrated 100% compliance, and you made sure that the kid got everything. Would I expect you to go through 432 instances of, well, we checked this then, et cetera? I'm not saying that it has to be that level of detail, but in us reading your description, it should be clear that this is what you did in that given year, not just a general description of a process, and that you have stated to us within your SPP APR that you have ensured that you looked at updated data, they achieved 100% compliance, and you made sure the kid got whatever they needed to get. That's the aspect we're looking for as it relates to the SPP APR. I think when you're thinking about the connection to DMS, and I encourage, you know, Matt, Kate, and others to come on in with that, like we have very specific reporting requirements for the SPP APR. We expect that to be in alignment when we think about DMS activities. But once again, I'm not saying, the other thing I would say though, Tammy, is we also look for numbers to add up. I can think of sometimes I'm reviewing APRs and in the box it might say you had 12 findings of noncompliance identified in a previous year, and then your narrative talks about correcting 14. That's going to be a problem. So like things like consistency with numbers and what's in narrative, not that your narrative says you only ensured correction in 2, but you're claiming in the box that you corrected all, those kinds of things. But I don't want you to feel like you're writing a dissertation to show for each specific thing, this is what we did for, you know, some of you have states with tons of districts, right, that may have non-compliance. I'm not expecting you to say necessarily for each one, this is what we did, but it should be clear that you did it for everyone. Not ask you to name names or anything, but that you did it for all of any instance of non-compliance you identified, that you ensured that there was correction, and you can only say you ensured correction if you met those 2 aspects. I hope that's helpful, but you can tell me if it's not. And Matt and Kate turned on their cameras, so they might be able to say much more, reinforce what I said more succinctly than I did.
Oh, I think Christine, you did a great job. I would just add, I think clearly, as Christine said, we wouldn't expect in the APRs that you report the details for each individual instance, but I would think that the description would tell us not only that I looked at subsequent data, but this is what I did in general to look at subsequent. Yes. I pulled down data from X data system or something along, or we did something along those lines. And then to continue with the link, during the discussions we will have during DMS, we'll be able to dig a little bit deeper, because it's not just a few lines in an APR about what that system looks like, what the challenges are, and what the process is. Again, we're not going to look at every individual instance of noncompliance either, but we may talk in some more detail about what that process looks like. And so, yeah, I think that gives you some information. And Kate, want to chime in?
Just one other additional thing that I think is helpful for states is to work with your TA providers around some of your drafted language for the APR. If you had questions around it, you know, that can get tricky for us as OSEP to review that prior to, we wouldn't be looking at that prior to submission, right? But I think your TA providers can really look at that language and say, yeah, this is enough detail, or you probably need to put a little bit more in there to really describe what you're engaging in. Because I think it's more about those activities that you're doing to ensure that you're looking at the updated data and what you're doing to verify the correction of the individual. And I think, you know, with DMS or the APR, those are the types of conversations we're going to be having. What are the actual activities that you're doing? And those numbers, I think Christine is right. Those are the things I've seen not kind of matching up a lot, where, and sometimes it's just an error and it'll get caught during clarification, but those would be the things I would look for in that APR language too.
Absolutely.
I would just
totally agree.
Yeah, and this is not, my next comment is not about 0902, but just sort of reinforcing what Kate said about the TA providers, as well as what Brenda said earlier on. One of the things I want to emphasize is it's always your choice, of course, when to use TA providers and what TA providers to use. But in addition to all of the resources that the TA providers have been already showcasing during some of our calls, in my experience, it is very useful when states have trusted TA providers on the monitoring calls or visits, so that everybody is hearing the same thing. So when we leave or finish up our monitoring, they can then help you work with your systems for improvement because they've heard the same message all along. So that's just kind of my shameless plug to recommend that you reach out to your TA providers for all the support across the spectrum of assistance that they do provide.
They really are incredible resources. So.
And I promise nobody paid me, so anyway.
No, they really are incredible, and have, you know, I've talked to the ones that we work with heavily in the data space a lot about like things we look for and red flags or consistent errors we see, so that then they're able to support you. So they're an incredible resource. So please utilize them.
So we are at the end of the presentation. So if we have any additional questions in Q&A or chat, or anybody wants to raise their hands, we can address those now.
A couple of things were in the question box as the call was going on. One, just an appreciation for the continuing of centering the work around kids and families. I think, Greg, those were definitely in relation to the letters that have come out. In addition to being thrilled about OSEP's focus on equity in this work. So both of those were supported. There was also a question around when the webinar would be available and where will it be posted. And so I'm gonna put that link again in the chat here. This is where all of the recordings are posted after the presentations, and the PowerPoints are included as well. And Swati, you can jump in. I want to say it's like the following week, most times that those go up, but if it's later,
yeah, they're usually up within the next few days. So
yeah, that's what
by Monday at least they'll be up.
Yeah. So look for those early next week if you want to share it with any of your staff who weren't able to be on today's call. And then one other comment that just says we love our TAs. So that's great. Another plug for the TA centers. But we would like to open it up. If folks have questions and they'd like to share those live, you can use the raise hand function and we can unmute you, or you continue to type in the chat or the Q&A box, and we'll read those out there. And Tammy has her hand raised, so let me see if I can. Swati, do you want to unmute her?
Let's talk, so she should be able to.
I think I can. Can you hear me?
Yes.
We were just wondering when the SPPAPR templates will open. Do y'all have any information on that for our population and reporting this upcoming February?
Yeah, the system is going to open. The target is December 20th. So I think we've mentioned before for Part B programs, you know, and for everyone, the system will open, but for Part B programs, Indicator 3, those data aren't going to be pre-filled until sometime in January because of when the assessment data comes to the department and the process that has to happen to verify that data before it's preloaded. So that'll be a change, but December 20th should be open. It will be open, not should, will. December 20th. No technical hiccups. It's December 20th. That's it.
Yep. Any other questions? I don't see other hand raised. Oh, what just comes in.
While we give some people a little bit of wait time, just want to encourage you, if you have feedback on what types of things would be useful in these calls moving forward, as I said, we intend to include more content on the different protocols and components that we're looking at in the coming months, but we want to respond to what your needs are. Feel free to contact me, Matthew Schneer, I think you can find me, or Kate, or your state lead. Just pass it, or through your TA providers. We talk to them on a regular basis. So just please feel free to let us know. Seems like we may be towards the end of our time. I don't think anybody will be too sad to get some extra time back in their day. Greg was talking to us earlier that tonight, or actually tomorrow, there is a lunar eclipse sometime between 1 and 6 a.m. Eastern time. So anybody who wants to be up for that, please go ahead. I think we have one raised hand, Gary Martin. I don't know how to open that.
I just allowed Gary to talk, so
Great,
you should be able to unmute yourself.
It still looks like you got mute on. Can you unmute?
Well, maybe it was an accident. Oh, that was an
He
error.
said that was an error.
That was an error. Okay, no problem. It happens. So, okay. So, Greg, do you have any parting words of wisdom for us?
Just want to thank everybody and hope that everybody has a safe, restful holiday.
Thank you, everyone.
And just a reminder that next month our call is the week earlier. It's not the fourth Thursday. It'll be 1 week earlier, and we'll talk to you then. So thanks, everyone.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you.